Welcome to History Teller YT, your gateway to stories that go beyond the textbooks, revealing the struggles, resilience, and triumphs of people often left out of mainstream history. Today, we dive deep into the untold saga of the Subanen people, the indigenous communities of Mindanao, whose history stretches across centuries of colonial imposition, cultural resilience, and steadfast resistance. From the time of Spanish conquest to the arrival of American colonizers, the Subanen have faced challenges that would have overwhelmed any ordinary community. Yet, they endured, preserving their lands, rituals, and social structures while adapting to unprecedented change. In 1898, when Spain lost the Philippines to the United States through the Treaty of Paris, the Subanen were confronted with a new form of colonization. The U.S. military categorized them as non-Christian tribes and placed them under the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes, effectively denying them full citizenship in their ancestral homelands. Unlike their Moro neighbors, whose resistance was often overt and militarized, the Subanen adopted a subtler, yet powerful strategy. Survival itself became resistance. Retreating into highland villages, holding onto ancestral practices, and passing down oral epics became acts of defiance. The arrival of laws, such as the Public Land Act of 1903, sought to redefine unregistered Subanen land as public property, facilitating settler occupation, yet the Subanen persisted. Rituals like the Buklog, storytelling, and the guidance of traditional leaders, or Timuay, became vehicles to preserve identity, maintain spiritual balance, and assert communal authority in the face of external pressures. Through American missionary schools, Christianization efforts, martial law policies, and modern globalization, the Subanen adapted while never surrendering the essence of their culture. Today, their struggles continue in new forms, defending ancestral domains, combating environmental destruction, and ensuring that younger generations inherit both their land and cultural wisdom. In this series, we will explore 20 detailed chapters of Subanen history, revealing how resistance can be quiet, persistent, and multidimensional, how culture can survive even under the weight of empires, and how a people can endure without ever losing themselves. As you listen, let this story inspire you to consider the countless untold histories around us. Stories of resilience, courage, and survival that illuminate the human spirit in ways no textbook ever could. Sit back, immerse yourself in the narrative, and let the journey through Subanen history begin, here on History Teller YT, where the past is never forgotten and every story matters. Long before the arrival of Spanish ships, American soldiers, or the Philippine Republic, the Subanen lived in the lush mountains and valleys of the Zamboanga Peninsula and parts of Misamis. The word Subanen itself means people of the river, reflecting how deeply their lives were tied to waterways. Rivers were their highways, sources of food, and spiritual veins connecting them to the land. In the lowlands, rice and corn grew, while the mountains provided rattan, bamboo, and medicinal herbs. Hunting and gathering supplemented their farming, creating a balance that allowed them to live without exhausting nature. Unlike centralized kingdoms or sultanates, the Subanen did not build walled cities or palaces. Instead, their strength was in kinship ties and small communities led by the Timuay, traditional chiefs. This decentralized system made them resilient. Even if one community was destroyed, the rest survived, like roots spreading underground. Their spiritual world was equally rich. They believed in Magbabea, the supreme creator, and a host of spirits tied to rivers, forests, and mountains. Every ritual was a conversation with these unseen beings, ensuring harmony. By the time outsiders arrived, the Subanen already carried centuries of knowledge, traditions, and a worldview that would become their shield in the storms of colonization. When the Spaniards began colonizing the Philippines in the 16th century, their presence was first concentrated in Luzon and the Visayas. Mindanao was harder to conquer because of strong resistance from Moro sultanates in Sulu, Maguindanao, and Lanao. For the Subanen, this meant that Spanish soldiers rarely marched directly into their mountain villages. Yet, they felt the ripple effects of conquest. Spanish missionaries attempted to reach the interior to convert them, often labeling them as pagan tribes in need of salvation. Lowland settlers began encroaching into Subanen valleys, bringing new farming techniques, but also new diseases and social hierarchies that threatened Subanen ways of life. Some Subanen were drawn into the orbit of the Spanish by trade, exchanging forest products like wax, honey, and rattan for cloth, salt, or iron tools. Others avoided all contact, retreating further into the highlands. Over time, stories of Spanish cruelty against other indigenous groups spread. Tales of forced labor, heavy tribute, and destruction of ancestral shrines reached Subanen ears, convincing many to resist subtle pressures to join colonial towns. While the Spaniards were busy fighting the Moros in costly wars, the Subanen developed a survival strategy: invisibility. They appeared submissive to outsiders, but, in reality, continued practicing their rituals and leadership systems out of sight. This early strategy would define their centuries-long resistance. By the late 1800s, the Philippines had already been reshaped by over 3 centuries of Spanish rule. The lowlands were dotted with towns, churches, and garrisons. Christianity had spread widely, and local elites tied themselves to colonial power. Yet in the uplands of Mindanao, the Subanen still lived largely as they always had, though increasingly surrounded by threats. They were often described by colonizers as backward or wild, terms that reflected prejudice more than truth. In reality, their refusal to abandon their customs was a conscious form of defiance. Their rituals, such as the Buklog Thanksgiving ceremony and their oral epics like the Guman, carried memory across generations. To outsiders, these were primitive dances or folk tales. To the Subanen, they were history, law, and resistance. Even as Spanish power crumbled in the 1890s under the weight of Philippine Revolution and foreign invasion, the Subanen maintained a separate rhythm of life. Unlike revolutionary movements in Luzon or armed Moro resistance, their struggle was not fought with guns or banners. It was fought with patience in the forests, in the stories told at night, in the rituals performed quietly in clearings. This quiet continuity was their strength. When Spain fell and America arrived, the Subanen were not liberated subjects waiting for salvation. They were already a people who had endured centuries of pressure without surrendering their soul. The year 1898 marked a turning point not only for the Philippines, but also for indigenous peoples like the Subanen. Spain, weakened by revolts at home and abroad, lost its grip on its far-flung colonies. In the short but decisive Spanish-American War, the United States defeated Spain and claimed the Philippines under the Treaty of Paris. For many Filipinos, especially those in Luzon and Visayas who had fought for independence, this was a bitter betrayal. Instead of freedom, they faced a new colonizer. For the Subanen of Zamboanga Peninsula and Misamis, the change in flags above colonial garrisons did not bring liberty either. The Americans portrayed themselves as modernizers who would bring education, infrastructure, and democracy. But behind the rhetoric lay the same goal Spain had pursued: the control of land and people. Mindanao, with its fertile valleys, forests, and mineral-rich mountains, was now seen as a frontier to be subdued and exploited. U.S. military officials described it as unsettled territory and viewed its inhabitants as tribes needing guidance. For the Subanen, this was the beginning of a new wave of pressure. Where Spain had mostly ignored them in favor of battles with the Moros, the Americans took a more systematic approach. Categorization, legislation, and slow but relentless encroachment. In this sense, the shift from Spain to America was not a liberation, but a reshaping of colonial chains. In 1901, the U.S. colonial government established the Bureau of Non-Christian Tribes. The very name revealed its worldview. The majority lowland Filipinos, converted to Christianity during Spanish times, were considered civilized, while groups like the Subanen were lumped together as non-Christian, implying backwardness. This label was not just a matter of words. It carried legal and political consequences. By defining the Subanen as wards of the state, the government denied them equal citizenship. They were treated as children incapable of managing their own affairs, needing oversight by American administrators and Christian Filipino officials. Reports written by American ethnographers portrayed the Subanen as timid and simple, often emphasizing their supposed lack of ambition or resistance compared to the more openly defiant Moro groups. But this was a misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate distortion. The Subanen's choice to avoid open conflict was not weakness, it was strategy. They understood that survival required patience, flexibility, and retreat when necessary. Still, the Bureau's policies opened the door to widespread land dispossession. By controlling how non-Christian tribes were governed, the Americans created a two-tiered system. One for Christianized Filipinos who were slowly integrated into representative politics, and another for indigenous peoples who remained under direct bureaucratic control. In this way, the Subanen were made strangers in their own homeland, forced into a category that justified further intrusion. While Moro resistance to American rule was dramatic, marked by bloody battles like Bud Dejo in 1906 and Bud Bagsack in 1913, the Subanen response was quieter. They did not assemble large armies or fortify mountain strongholds. Instead, they relied on what might be called resistance in the shadows. When soldiers or government officials advanced, Subanen families moved deeper into the mountains. When schools and missions attempted to impose new religions and languages, they outwardly complied, but secretly kept their rituals alive. This was a form of defiance that outsiders often misread as passivity. Yet, survival itself was an act of rebellion. Each time a family rebuilt its house in the forest, each time a Timuay presided over a ritual in defiance of missionary bans, the Subanen asserted their right to exist on their own terms. Oral traditions carried stories of these years, tales of evasion, of hiding sacred objects from missionaries, of disguising rituals as harmless dances so authorities would not interfere. In this way, the Subanen created a dual life, one visible to outsiders, shaped by the demands of colonial power, and one hidden, where ancestral customs and spirits continued to rule. Unlike the dramatic clashes of Moro warriors, the Subanen resistance was less likely to make headlines, but no less powerful. It was resistance measured not in battles won or lost, but in generations that endured without disappearing. The most powerful weapon the Americans used against the Subanen was not a rifle or a cannon, but the pen. In 1903, the U.S. colonial government passed the Public Land Act, which declared that all lands not registered under Spanish law would now be considered public property. At first glance, this may have seemed like a neutral, technical law, just a matter of paperwork. But for indigenous groups like the Subanen, it was devastating. Their ancestral domains had never been measured by surveyors or recorded in colonial offices. Their relationship with the land was communal, spiritual, and fluid. Forests, rivers, and fields belonged to everyone in the community, not to individuals who held paper deeds. With the stroke of a pen, all of these lands were suddenly reclassified as unoccupied and open for settlement. Outsiders from Luzon and Visayas, encouraged by promises of fertile soil, began migrating into Mindanao. Government resettlement programs provided them with legal titles, while the Subanen, who had lived in these lands for generations, were reduced to squatters in their own homeland. It was dispossession without a battle, conquest disguised as paperwork. The Subanen had no armies to defend their titles because they had never needed written titles at all. Their title was their memory, their rituals, and the bones of ancestors buried in the soil. But to the Americans, that was invisible and therefore irrelevant. Once the law opened the door, settlers began arriving in large numbers. At first, it was just a trickle. Farmers from Cebu or Bohol seeking better opportunities. Small groups establishing homesteads in the valleys of Zamboanga Peninsula and Misamis. But over the decades, the trickle became a flood. Entire communities were transplanted from the crowded Visayas and Luzon to the so-called frontier of Mindanao. Government propaganda painted Mindanao as a land of promise, a place where hardworking Christian families could find land and prosperity. But this promise came at the expense of the Subanen and other indigenous groups. Fertile plains once filled with Subanen farms or hunting grounds were now fenced off for new settlers. Rivers once used for fishing and transport were diverted or polluted. Slowly, the Subanen were pushed upward into less fertile highlands and deeper forests. Every step into the mountains was a step away from ancestral valleys, but also a form of resistance. They refused to vanish. They would not assimilate completely into lowland towns, nor would they abandon their rituals, even if performed in secret. For many families, survival meant adapting, taking wage labor on settler farms, selling forest products, or trading with migrants. Yet, even in these interactions, they maintained a strong sense of difference. To be Subanen was not just to speak a language or wear traditional clothing. It was to carry a worldview in which land could never be bought or sold, only inherited from the Creator and passed on to the next generation. While some indigenous groups chose open rebellion, the Subanen's main strategy during this wave of dispossession was retreat, a choice that outsiders often misinterpreted as passivity. But to retreat was not to surrender. It was a deliberate act of survival. Subanen families built new villages in the forested uplands, far from the reach of colonial administrators. They shifted agricultural practices to adapt to mountain soil, planting root crops like cassava and taro that could sustain them, even in poor conditions. By doing so, they maintained independence, even as settlers claimed the lowlands. Oral accounts from elders recall how families would carry sacred objects, ritual drums, heirloom jars, charms blessed by shamans, as they moved deeper into the mountains. These were not just possessions. They were links to their ancestors, symbols that even if the landscape changed, Subanen identity remained intact. Resistance also took the form of invisibility, blending into the forest when soldiers came, refusing to register land claims, or giving only vague answers when questioned by government officials. To an American bureaucrat, these were signs of laziness or ignorance. But in truth, they were strategies to avoid being trapped by a system designed to dispossess them. Invisibility protected them from forced assimilation. Survival itself became a weapon, a quiet defiance that ensured the Subanen story would not end with colonization, but would continue, whispered in rituals and sung in epics, waiting for a time when their rights would finally be recognized. Among the most enduring cultural expressions of the Subanen is the Buklog ritual, a Thanksgiving ceremony where men, women, and children dance on a wooden platform raised above the ground, the pounding of their feet echoing like drums across the village. To outsiders, especially missionaries and colonial officials, the Buklog appeared as a quaint but pagan practice, something to be condemned or replaced with Christian festivals. Yet for the Subanen, the Buklog was far more than entertainment. It was a direct communication with the spirits, a renewal of bonds with ancestors, and a declaration that the Subanen way of life remained intact despite colonization. The ritual is elaborate. Logs are cut and tied together to form a massive, springy platform. Offerings are placed, chants are recited, and shamans lead prayers to ensure harmony between the human world and the unseen spirits of land and water. During the American period, when missionaries sought to erase indigenous customs, the Buklog became an act of resistance. Some communities performed it in secrecy, away from the gaze of priests or officials. Others adapted by disguising the ritual as a harvest festival, allowing it to continue under colonial noses. Each Buklog performed was a message to both ancestors and colonizers. The Subanen had not surrendered. Even today, when UNESCO recognized Buklog in 2019 as an intangible cultural heritage in need of safeguarding, it was not just honoring a dance, but centuries of resilience. Every stomp on that platform resounded as a heartbeat of survival. The Subanen did not have kings, sultans, or centralized rulers. Instead, their society was guided by Timuay, traditional leaders chosen not only for their wisdom, but also for their fairness, spiritual knowledge, and ability to keep harmony within the community. During the American and Philippine colonial administrations, government-appointed officials, such as barrio captains or datas, were imposed to formalize governance in indigenous areas. Yet the authority of the Timuay remained deeply respected among the Subanen. A Timuay presided over disputes, organized rituals, and safeguarded sacred knowledge. Unlike colonial officials, whose power came from written decrees or appointed titles, the Timuay's power came from trust and kinship. Even when settlers, missionaries, or government agencies entered Subanen territory, the community still turned to the Timuay first. This dual system, outwardly acknowledging government officials while quietly preserving the authority of the Timuay, was another subtle form of resistance. By keeping their own leadership intact, the Subanen preserved the framework of their society. Oral accounts tell of Timuay negotiating with outsiders, sometimes agreeing to compromise, but always ensuring that community rituals and ancestral lands remained recognized internally, even if not on official papers. In this way, the Subanen adapted without surrendering. The Timuay embodied resilience, a living bridge between the pre-colonial world and the pressures of modern states. To this day, Subanen councils of Timuay continue to play a vital role in asserting ancestral rights and cultural identity. In a world where written records were absent and colonial archives dismissed indigenous voices, the Subanen relied on oral tradition to safeguard their history. Among their most treasured legacies are oral epics like the Guman and Sugidanon. These are not mere stories for amusement. They're sprawling narratives filled with wisdom, history, and moral lessons. Recited by skilled storytellers during nights of gathering, the epics could last for hours, sometimes even days. They preserve the memory of ancestors, the origins of rivers and mountains, the values of courage, generosity, and respect for the spirits. During the American and later Philippine administrations, when schools and missionaries often discouraged indigenous languages and labeled native epics as folk tales, the act of retelling these stories became an act of cultural defiance. Every recitation reminded the youth of their identity, reinforcing that they came from a people with deep knowledge and rich tradition. Colonizers might claim Subanen history was unwritten and therefore non-existent, but the epics proved otherwise. History lived in memory, in song, in rhythm. They were libraries without paper, universities without classrooms. Through these stories, the Subanen carried forward a worldview that could not be erased by land laws, schools, or churches. As long as the Guman and Sugidanon were spoken, the Subanen were never defeated. The voice of the storyteller was itself a weapon, ensuring continuity when everything else was under siege. While American soldiers secured Mindanao with force, another campaign followed closely behind, the mission to convert. Protestant missionaries from the United States and Catholic missionaries, mostly supported by the Spanish clergy, but now working under American tolerance, poured into the Samboanga Peninsula and Misamis. Their goal was not only to spread religion, but also to civilize the Subanen and other indigenous groups. Missionaries built schools beside chapels, insisting that conversion to Christianity went hand in hand with learning to read and write. To the colonial authorities, the mission schools were essential tools. They introduced the English language, reshaped worldviews, and replaced indigenous rituals with Christian practices. But for the Subanen, the arrival of missionaries posed a direct threat to their spiritual world. Priests and pastors condemned the Buklog as devil worship, dismissed the Timuay as irrelevant, and labeled oral epics as superstition. They encouraged Subanen families to abandon rituals, to baptize their children with Christian names, and to redefine their identities within a framework foreign to their ancestors. Yet resistance was not always open confrontation. Many Subanen practiced what scholars later called double life. Outwardly, they attended Mass or Protestant services, sent their children to school, and appeared to comply. But inside their homes and in mountain clearings, rituals to the spirits continued, and stories of the ancestors were still told. The Subanen balanced two worlds, one demanded by colonizers and another rooted in their sacred traditions. By doing so, they ensured survival without erasure. Education was one of the strongest tools the Americans used to assimilate indigenous communities. English became the language of instruction, and with it came American values of individualism, competition, and patriotism to a colonial flag. For the Subanen, who had long emphasized communal landholding, kinship ties, and oral wisdom, this system was disorienting. Children were taught that progress meant abandoning old ways, that indigenous rituals were signs of backwardness, and that the future lay in becoming modern Filipinos under American guidance. Yet education was also a double-edged sword. Some Subanen families saw in schooling an opportunity. Literacy could provide access to jobs, government positions, and new forms of knowledge. A handful of Subanen youth became teachers, clerks, or intermediaries between their communities and the colonial state. This was adaptation, not surrender. In many cases, Subanen parents instructed their children to learn what they teach in school, but do not forget what we teach at home. This balancing act created a generation that could navigate two worlds, the formal, paper-driven world of the state and the spiritual, ritual-centered world of their ancestors. Missionaries might have hoped to erase Subanen identity through schools, but instead, schooling often produced sharper awareness of difference. The very act of comparing what was taught in the classroom with what was preserved at home reminded Subanen youth that they came from a distinct heritage worth defending. Christianization and schooling could have erased Subanen culture, but instead they forged a subtler form of resistance, the cultivation of dual identity. Many Subanen outwardly participated in church life, attending services, celebrating Christian holidays, or even taking Christian names. But at home, especially during harvests, illnesses, or community gatherings, they returned to ancestral rituals. Shamans still performed healing ceremonies, and Timuay still presided over community disputes according to customary law. Oral accounts tell of families who would quietly hide ritual objects from visiting missionaries, only to bring them out again once the outsiders left. Others performed Buklog ceremonies deep in the forest, out of sight. This duplicity was not hypocrisy, but survival. It allowed the Subanen to gain the benefits of schooling and avoid punishment from authorities, while at the same time ensuring that their ancestral spirits were still honored. Over time, this dual identity became a powerful form of resilience. It proved that assimilation was never complete, that even under pressure, the Subanen could adapt without losing themselves. Theirs was not a loud defiance, but a quiet, persistent one. And in many ways, it was more enduring than open rebellion, for it lived in the hearts of each family, invisible to colonial eyes, but deeply rooted in Subanen memory. When the Philippines gained independence in 1946, it was this dual identity that allowed the Subanen to emerge still holding on to their traditions, ready to confront the next phase of marginalization under a new republic. When the Philippines finally declared independence on July 4th, 1946, it was a moment of celebration across the nation. After centuries of Spanish rule and nearly 5 decades of American control, the islands now stood as a republic. But for the Subanen, this independence did not bring the recognition they had hoped for. Instead of correcting colonial injustices, the new Philippine government carried forward many of the same policies that had marginalized indigenous groups. Homestead programs, first introduced by the Americans, were revived and expanded in the 1950s and 1960s to address land shortages in Luzon and the Visayas. Thousands of settler families were relocated to Mindanao, where they were granted legal land titles. Once again, the Subanen watched as their ancestral valleys were carved up into plots for strangers. Unlike the celebrated heroes of Luzon and Visayas, the Subanen had no seat at the political table, no voice in Congress, and no representation in the young republic's institutions. Their rituals, leadership systems, and oral traditions were seen as relics, not as foundations of identity. The new government viewed development in terms of plantations, roads, and logging concessions, all of which demanded land that had always belonged to indigenous peoples. Independence, in effect, meant a transfer of power from foreign colonizers to lowland elites, while the Subanen remained excluded. What had been promised as liberation became yet another layer of marginalization, pushing the Subanen further into invisibility. In the decades after independence, the fertile plains of Zamboanga Peninsula and Misamis became prime targets for economic exploitation. Logging companies were granted concessions that stripped away forests which had sustained Subanen communities for generations. The timber was shipped abroad or used for construction in booming lowland cities, while the Subanen who had depended on these forests for food, medicine, and materials were left with barren hillsides. Rivers once clear and rich with fish grew muddy with silt. Hunting grounds disappeared, and swidden fields no longer produced abundant harvests. Plantations followed, fencing off large tracts of land for commercial crops like corn, coconut, and rubber. Outsiders controlled the profits, while the Subanen were hired as cheap laborers on what had once been their own land. Dispossession now came not only from laws, but also from bulldozers and chainsaws. Each new concession pushed the Subanen deeper into the mountains, narrowing the space in which they could survive. Yet even in the face of this devastation, the Subanen did not abandon their rituals. The Buklog continued, though often smaller and less frequent due to displacement. Timuay still gathered communities to resolve disputes, even if government officials dismissed their authority. By maintaining these practices, the Subanen resisted erasure. Though the plains and forests were stripped away, their cultural heartbeat remained, echoing defiantly against the roar of chainsaws and the march of settlers. Unlike the Moro groups who launched armed rebellions against the Philippine state, the Subanen chose different paths of resistance during the post-war decades. Their approach was not violent confrontation, but peaceful assertion of rights through petitions, appeals, and alliances. Timuay leaders sent letters to government offices demanding recognition of ancestral land, though most were ignored or buried under bureaucracy. Communities organized meetings to discuss how to adapt to changing circumstances, often reaffirming their commitment to Subanen identity even as land dwindled. In the 1960s and 1970s, as logging intensified, some Subanen began to build alliances with church groups, student activists, and later with non-governmental organizations. These partnerships gave them a louder voice, one that could be heard beyond the mountains. Their petitions may not have stopped the bulldozers, but they planted seeds of awareness in the broader Filipino public. Resistance also took symbolic forms. The preservation of rituals, the teaching of oral epics to children, and the insistence that despite displacement, they were not squatters but heirs to ancestral land. Theirs was a quiet but steady defiance. By refusing to vanish, by continuing to name rivers, mountains, and valleys in their own language, the Subanen kept alive a truth that no legal title could erase, that the land had always been theirs, and that survival itself was resistance. When Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in 1972, the official justification was to suppress communist insurgency and Moro separatism. But for indigenous groups like the Subanen, martial law meant something far more concrete: the opening of their remaining ancestral lands to unchecked exploitation. Under martial law, Marcos had the power to grant logging and mining concessions without the usual checks and balances. Politically connected families and foreign corporations were handed vast tracts of Mindanao's forests and mineral-rich mountains. For the Subanen of Samboanga Peninsula and Misamis, this spelled disaster. Logging trucks rolled into areas that had never before been reached by roads, carrying away centuries-old hardwood trees. Mining operations blasted mountains and poisoned rivers with chemicals. The Subanen, who depended on these ecosystems for food, medicine, and spiritual balance, suddenly found their environment collapsing. Entire villages were displaced, forced to move higher into the mountains or migrate elsewhere. Soldiers stationed in the area under the pretext of maintaining order often acted as protectors of company interests, intimidating communities who resisted. For the Subanen, the violence of martial law was not only in the presence of armed men, but in the slow, suffocating loss of their forests. Land that had once been abundant now felt like a cage, shrinking year after year. Yet, even amid fear and destruction, the Subanen began to find new ways to resist, planting the seeds of a broader indigenous movement that would rise in the years to come. The onslaught of martial law forced the Subanen to reconsider their strategies. Retreat and invisibility had worked for centuries, but the scale of destruction in the 1970s demanded new forms of resistance. It was during this time that Subanen communities began linking with other indigenous groups across Mindanao, such as the Manobo, Higanon, and Taboli. Together, they formed what came to be known broadly as the Lumad movement, a collective identity for Mindanao's non-Islamized indigenous peoples. This solidarity was not automatic. Each group had its own traditions, languages, and histories. but they shared a common experience of dispossession under logging, plantations, and mining concessions, all intensified under martial law. For the Subanen, joining the Lumad movement meant stepping into a larger arena of resistance. Timuay councils, once focused only on local disputes and rituals, became spaces where strategies were shared and collective petitions were drafted. Activists and church workers helped amplify their voices, connecting their struggles with national and even international human rights networks. Oral traditions that once spoke only of ancestral spirits began to include references to political injustice, weaving together spirituality and activism. In this way, the Subanen showed that they could adapt without losing their identity. They embraced unity while still carrying their own cultural distinctiveness. Resistance was no longer just about survival in the mountains. It was about asserting rights in the face of a regime that sought to erase them. One of the most powerful responses to martial law's devastation was the renewed effort of Subanen elders to pass knowledge to the younger generation. With forests falling to chainsaws and rivers poisoned by mining, there was a fear that the link between people and land would be severed forever. Elders reminded the youth that the mountains and rivers are our first inheritance, a phrase repeated in oral teachings and rituals. Storytelling became even more important. Epics like the Guman were retold not only as entertainment, but as reminders of values: courage, kinship, respect for the spirits, and the sacredness of land. Youth were encouraged to learn traditional rituals, songs, and dances, even as they attended government schools that dismissed such practices as primitive. The act of teaching and remembering became a form of defiance. Communities that had lost their farms to plantations or their forests to loggers still gathered for Buklog ceremonies, sometimes in reduced forms, but always with the same spirit, to show that the Subanen way of life had not been broken. This intergenerational transfer of knowledge was crucial because it ensured continuity. Even when young Subanen left to work in towns or cities, they carried with them the stories of their elders. Martial law could displace bodies and destroy forests, but it could not erase memory. That memory, spoken, sung, and danced, became the Subanen shield, ensuring that their struggle would outlive the dictatorship and continue into the era of democracy that followed. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Philippines was emerging from the shadow of martial law. The fall of Marcos in 1986 opened a period of transition, where civil society organizations, church groups, and indigenous movements gained new energy. For the Subanen, this era was a turning point. After centuries of invisibility under Spanish, American, and Philippine rule, there was finally space to demand recognition. Across Mindanao, indigenous groups began pressing for a law that would recognize their ancestral lands not as public land, but as territories with cultural and historical ownership. Their pressure coincided with global shifts. The United Nations and other international bodies were increasingly vocal about indigenous peoples' rights. Out of this momentum came the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997, a landmark legislation. For the first time in Philippine history, the state formally recognized the concept of ancestral domain. The law promised that indigenous communities like the Subanen could file claims, secure legal titles, and protect their lands from exploitation. But passing the law was only the first step. The Subanen soon discovered that recognition on paper was far different from recognition in practice. Bureaucracy was slow, corporations resisted, and local elites tried to manipulate the process. Yet for the Subanen, IPRA was more than just a legal tool. It was proof that centuries of quiet resistance, survival, rituals, oral traditions had not been in vain. The law validated what they had always known. Their land was not empty, it was theirs. The late 1990s and early 2000s also brought new challenges that tested the Subanen's resolve. Even with IPRA in place, the Philippine government continued to promote large-scale mining and logging projects, often backed by foreign investors. The Zamboanga Peninsula and Misamis Occidental, traditional Subanen homelands, were identified as resource-rich areas ripe for development. Mining companies moved aggressively, applying for permits that overlapped with Subanen ancestral domains. For many communities, this was déjà vu. The same forests and rivers that had been threatened under martial law were once again under siege, but this time in the name of economic growth. Subanen leaders filed petitions, staged peaceful protests, and collaborated with non-governmental organizations to challenge these projects. Some victories were achieved. In certain cases, mining operations were suspended or delayed due to community resistance. But the struggle was uneven. There were stories of leaders harassed, communities divided, and promises of jobs or infrastructure dangled before the poor as bait for consent. Still, the Subanen held on. They revived the role of Timuay councils, not only for cultural leadership, but also for legal advocacy. Rituals like Buklog were performed in conjunction with political mobilizations, showing that their resistance was both spiritual and legal. For the Subanen, saying no to mining was not simply about economics. It was about defending the sacred. Every mountain had a spirit, every river an ancestor. To allow destruction was to betray their heritage. In this way, cultural resilience became inseparable from political resistance. While the legal and political struggles continued, the Subanen gained a new kind of recognition on the global stage. In 2019, UNESCO inscribed the Buklog ritual on its list of intangible cultural heritage in need of urgent safeguarding. For outsiders, this was a cultural achievement, an acknowledgement that the Subanen's traditions had global value. But for the Subanen themselves, it meant something deeper, validation that their rituals were not remnants of a dying culture, but living acts of resistance. The Buklog, with its elevated wooden platform that resonates like a drum, symbolizes unity between community members, ancestors, and spirits. To keep it alive despite centuries of missionary condemnation, legal marginalization, and economic exploitation was itself a victory. The recognition by UNESCO did not solve the pressing issues of land rights, poverty, or displacement, but it gave the Subanen a platform to assert that they were not relics of the past. They were a people with a living culture and an ongoing struggle. Subanen leaders began to use this international visibility to pressure the Philippine government to honor ancestral domain claims more seriously. Youth groups took pride in learning rituals once dismissed as pagan, blending modern activism with traditional identity. In this sense, the Buklog's global recognition was not an end, but a continuation, proof that the Subanen's resistance, rooted in culture, could adapt to a globalized world. Their survival was no longer just about hiding in the mountains. It was about stepping onto the world stage with dignity, demanding that their heritage and their lands be respected. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it high hopes for indigenous groups like the Subanen. After the passing of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997, many thought the 2000s would finally mark a turning point where ancestral land rights would be secured. The Philippine government, under its decentralization framework, pushed local governments to play a greater role in development planning. For the Subanen, this shift presented both opportunity and danger. On one hand, decentralization meant that local governments, which were closer to indigenous communities, could be more responsive. Some local officials expressed openness to recognizing Subanen claims. On the other hand, Many politicians had close ties with logging and mining interests. Instead of empowering Subanen voices, decentralization sometimes made them more vulnerable, forcing them to negotiate directly with powerful local elites. Petitions for certificates of ancestral domain title, CATs, dragged on for years, caught in bureaucratic red tape. Mining companies, meanwhile, exploited these delays, securing exploration permits while ancestral claims were unresolved. For Subanen villages, it felt like a cruel irony. The law was on their side, yet the system designed to implement it was stacked against them. Despite this, Subanen leaders continued to push forward, learning the language of bureaucracy and law, filing documents, attending hearings, and insisting that their rights not be brushed aside. Their resilience lay not in armed struggle, but in persistence, patience, and a refusal to abandon hope even when processes seemed endless. The 2000s also deepened another challenge: the growing influence of migration and modernization in Subanen territories. Homesteaders from Luzon and the Visayas had been arriving since the American period, but by the early 21st century, the influx reached new intensity. Population growth, land scarcity in other regions, and government resettlement programs led to increasing numbers of settlers establishing farms and towns on lands the Subanen considered ancestral. With them came new schools, markets, and churches, which altered the cultural landscape of Zamboanga Peninsula and Misamis. Subanen youth were drawn to towns in search of jobs and education. While this provided opportunities, it also risked pulling them away from their roots. Some young Subanen began to feel embarrassed about practicing rituals like the Buklog, fearing ridicule from peers who saw it as backward. The use of Subanen language declined in some villages, replaced by Cebuano or Tagalog. Yet, within this erosion lay seeds of revival. A number of youth leaders began reclaiming their identity, creating cultural organizations in schools and universities. They staged performances of Subanen dances, wrote poems in their native tongue, and even used social media to highlight their heritage. For them, modernization was not simply a threat, it was also a tool. By adapting new platforms, they found ways to keep their traditions alive in a changing world. The Subanen's challenge in this era was balancing survival in a modern economy while refusing to let their culture vanish into silence. The early 21st century also brought heightened awareness of environmental issues, both globally and locally. For the Subanen, who had long framed their struggle in terms of land and forest protection, this was an important shift. International NGOs and environmental groups increasingly saw indigenous communities as natural allies in conservation. The Subanen's intimate relationship with their forests, treating rivers, mountains, and trees as sacred, aligned with modern ecological principles. However, this recognition came at a time when their environment was under severe threat. Large-scale mining projects, particularly in Zamboanga del Sur and Misamis Occidental, loomed over ancestral lands. Logging, though officially regulated, continued illegally in many areas. Rivers that once teemed with fish became polluted, forcing communities to walk farther for clean water. In response, the Subanen combined traditional practices with modern advocacy. Rituals were performed not just for Thanksgiving, but also as acts of protest, blessing rivers threatened by mining, or invoking ancestral spirits to protect forests. Partnerships with NGOs provided legal training, mapping skills, and platforms for international advocacy. Subanen leaders began speaking not just as indigenous representatives, but as environmental defenders. This dual identity strengthened their struggle, connecting them to global conversations about climate change and biodiversity. Though their communities remained vulnerable, their resilience shone through. by asserting that the mountains and rivers are our inheritance. They reminded both the state and the world that the survival of the environment and the survival of the Subanen were inseparable. The 2010s brought a wave of technology that transformed the ways the Subanen could resist, preserve, and assert their identity. Social media, smartphones, and internet access reached even remote areas of Mindanao, opening new avenues for activism. Subanen youth began documenting rituals like the Buklog, uploading photos and videos, creating Facebook pages, YouTube channels, and blogs to showcase their heritage. These platforms allowed them to reach audiences far beyond their villages, connecting with both other indigenous groups in the Philippines and global supporters. The digital era also enabled the Subanen to document environmental destruction in real time. Illegal logging, river pollution, and mining activities could be recorded and shared online, forcing government agencies and civil society to take notice. This was a major shift from previous generations, who relied on petitions, local councils, or oral testimony. Now, the Subanen could amplify their grievances, organize protests, and network with NGOs from the comfort of their villages. Yet, the digital landscape was also a double-edged sword. Exposure brought scrutiny, sometimes harassment, and a risk of misrepresentation. Traditional rituals, once intimate, were now subject to public commentary and judgment. Despite these challenges, the Subanen harnessed digital tools strategically. By controlling their narratives, they could assert both cultural pride and legal claims, merging ancestral knowledge with modern technology. The message was clear: survival and resistance could adapt to a globalized world without losing authenticity. Even in the digital age, the Subanen faced relentless challenges from extractive industries. Mining companies, large-scale plantations, and logging operations continued to encroach on ancestral lands, often with government permits or tacit approval. Despite the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, of 1997, enforcement remained inconsistent. Many Subanen communities reported illegal activities, including deforestation, river contamination, and land grabs. In response, Subanen leaders combined traditional strategies with modern advocacy. Timuay councils became formal platforms for documenting violations, negotiating with authorities, and organizing peaceful resistance. Rituals such as Buklog were performed during protests, symbolically reinforcing the sacredness of land and rivers. Partnerships with environmental and human rights organizations provided legal support, scientific documentation, and international visibility. Subanen youth, fluent in digital tools, shared evidence with global media, raising awareness of ongoing violations. Despite the persistent threat of economic and political power structures, the Subanen maintained a cohesive strategy: protect land, preserve culture, and assert rights simultaneously. This era demonstrated that Subanen resistance was no longer only about surviving invisibly in the mountains. It had evolved into a sophisticated, multi-layered movement that intertwined legal, cultural, and technological tools to ensure continuity and visibility. While the 2010s brought technology and advocacy, the heart of Subanen resilience remained rooted in intergenerational knowledge and cultural continuity. Elders continued to teach younger generations rituals, oral epics, and traditional ecological knowledge. Stories of ancestral bravery, strategies for survival, and moral lessons embedded in the Guman and Sugidanon epics were adapted to reflect contemporary struggles, environmental crises, legal battles, and the digital age. Cultural revival programs, often spearheaded by Subanen youth groups, reinvigorated the practice of Buklog, with communities constructing platforms even in urban or semi-urban areas to maintain visibility. Schools within Subanen communities incorporated traditional knowledge into curricula, ensuring that children learned both modern subjects and ancestral wisdom. Festivals celebrating Subanen culture began attracting tourists and academics. But the communities maintained control, presenting traditions on their own terms rather than as spectacle for outsiders. This intergenerational transmission was crucial for sustaining identity, especially amid urban migration and globalization. The Subanen demonstrated that resistance is not only about opposing threats, but also about affirming life through dance, song, storytelling, and ceremony. By blending ancestral traditions with modern tools, they ensured that their culture remained vibrant, visible, and adaptable. The 2010s proved that Subanen resilience could thrive even in the face of unprecedented technological, environmental, and economic pressures. The global COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 to 2022 brought unprecedented challenges to communities worldwide, and the Subanen were no exception. For generations, their resistance had focused on land, culture, and survival amidst external pressures from colonizers, settlers, and extractive industries. But the pandemic introduced a new threat: public health crises combined with economic disruption. Subanen villages, often located in remote highlands or along rivers, lacked immediate access to hospitals, medical personnel, or vaccines in the early months. Travel restrictions, lockdowns, and disrupted supply chains hindered the movement of food, medicine, and other essentials. Many families who relied on small-scale farming or forest resources suddenly faced shortages as markets closed or transport became difficult. Schools, both government and community-run, were shuttered, interrupting the educational and cultural continuity of Subanen youth. But the Subanen, drawing on centuries of resilience, adapted. Communities implemented localized systems of care, organizing elders and volunteers to monitor health, distribute resources, and educate families about hygiene and disease prevention. Traditional knowledge about medicinal plants, once undervalued, became vital in supplementing healthcare in areas with limited access to modern medicine. Despite fear and uncertainty, the Subanen emphasized collective responsibility, a core value in their social structure, demonstrating that survival depended not just on individual action, but on the solidarity of the community. The pandemic, though a new challenge, reinforced the importance of ancestral wisdom and community organization in maintaining resilience. The 2020s also accelerated the influence of globalization on Subanen communities. Digital connectivity had already opened new avenues for activism in the previous decade, but the pandemic intensified reliance on technology. Social media platforms, video conferencing, and online advocacy networks became essential for maintaining cultural practice, coordinating environmental campaigns, and engaging with international organizations. The Subanen joined broader global indigenous networks, sharing their experiences with deforestation, mining encroachment, and the protection of sacred sites. Global attention provided both visibility and leverage in legal and political struggles, pressuring corporations and government agencies to respect ancestral domain rights. However, globalization also brought challenges. Commercial interests sought to commodify Subanen culture, promoting festivals, crafts, or rituals as tourist attractions or marketing tools. Outsiders' interpretations risked reducing rich cultural practices like the Buklog or oral epics to spectacles. Subanen leaders responded strategically, asserting control over narratives and ensuring that any representation was community-led, protecting authenticity while engaging with global audiences. This era emphasized that survival in a globalized world requires both adaptation and vigilance. By leveraging technology, the Subanen expanded their reach, connecting their centuries-old struggles with modern human rights frameworks, environmental advocacy, and international indigenous solidarity. One of the central pillars of Subanen resilience has always been the transmission of ancestral knowledge from elders to the younger generations. From pre-colonial times through Spanish, American, and Philippine colonial periods, Subanen elders, the Timuay and other respected community figures, acted as the living repositories of history, rituals, environmental knowledge, and social norms. In the modern era, particularly during the 2010s and 2020s, this transmission faced new pressures. Migration, urbanization, and exposure to global culture threatened to disrupt the continuity of ancestral wisdom. Youth often left villages to pursue education or employment in urban centers, and the younger generation was increasingly exposed to mainstream Philippine and global media, often marginalizing indigenous languages, stories, and practices. Yet Subanen communities adapted. Elders began integrating traditional knowledge into structured programs within the community, pairing ritual instruction with formal schooling. Children learned not only the Buklog dance, but also its history, the symbolism of offerings, and the ethical and spiritual lessons embedded in each step. Oral epics, such as the Guman and Sugidanon, were taught not just as stories, but as tools to understand governance, kinship, and ecological management. By codifying and systematizing knowledge, Subanen elders ensured that even if youth spent time away from the village, the core teachings of their culture would remain accessible. This conscious effort to preserve and transmit ancestral knowledge highlighted a key strategy of resilience: adaptation without erasure. Formal education, once a colonial tool intended to assimilate indigenous peoples, has been transformed by the Subanen into a vehicle for empowerment. Schools within Subanen communities now integrate curricula that combine modern subjects, mathematics, science, literacy, and technology, with lessons in indigenous culture, ecology, and governance. For example, students may study river systems in science class while simultaneously learning about the spiritual significance of rivers in Subanen rituals. This dual approach helps youth navigate both the modern state and their ancestral traditions. Moreover, literacy and technological skills enable the Subanen to advocate more effectively for land rights and environmental protection. Young Subanen leaders draft legal petitions, document environmental damage, and engage with NGOs and government agencies using the tools they acquire in school. Beyond practical applications, education has become a means to reclaim narrative authority. Whereas colonial and post-colonial systems once labeled Subanen culture as backward or pagan, today educated youth are redefining their identity, demonstrating that indigenous knowledge is rigorous, practical, and morally grounded. The strategic use of education highlights the Subanen's ability to adapt colonial tools for their own purposes, turning instruments of assimilation into means of cultural preservation and political empowerment. Leadership transmission is another vital aspect of intergenerational education among the Subanen. The Timuay system, traditionally based on wisdom, kinship, and spiritual authority, continues to be central in guiding communities. Elders mentor young leaders, passing on knowledge of conflict resolution, negotiation with external authorities, ceremonial obligations, and environmental stewardship. This mentorship is often experiential, with youth observing elders during rituals, community meetings, and disputes. In the 2010s and 2020s, mentorship has also expanded to include modern governance skills, legal literacy, and advocacy techniques. Young Subanen leaders now participate in workshops, attend national indigenous assemblies, and liaise with NGOs to strengthen their community's capacity to navigate the complexities of modern Philippine governance. This combination of traditional mentorship and contemporary skill building ensures that leadership remains culturally grounded, yet operationally effective in modern contexts. Furthermore, mentorship reinforces values such as community cohesion, respect for elders, environmental stewardship, and spiritual awareness. By blending ancestral guidance with modern tools, the Subanen create a sustainable model for the continuity of cultural identity, community governance, and resistance. In essence, intergenerational education is not only about survival. It is about ensuring that Subanen identity thrives in a world that continues to challenge both their land and their culture. In the 21st century, digital platforms have transformed the Subanen's capacity for advocacy and community organization. Social media, websites, and online forums allow communities to highlight environmental violations, land disputes, and cultural events in real time. Digital advocacy has proven particularly effective against illegal logging, mining, and encroachment by commercial entities. Subanen youth, equipped with smartphones, cameras, and internet access, document activities that threaten ancestral domains and share these with NGOs, government agencies, and international organizations. These digital campaigns amplify local voices to national and global audiences, mobilizing support for policy enforcement, legal action, and community protection. Online storytelling platforms preserve oral narratives, enabling the younger generation to engage with traditional stories while learning language, ethics, and ecological knowledge. Digital tools also allow Subanen communities to network with other Lumad groups, Indigenous peoples worldwide, and environmental advocacy organizations. This connectivity fosters solidarity, knowledge sharing, and joint action, enhancing the effectiveness of campaigns while building awareness of Subanen struggles globally. Importantly, digital advocacy does not replace traditional methods. It complements rituals, storytelling, and local governance structures, integrating ancestral wisdom with modern tools to strengthen cultural resilience, environmental stewardship, and political engagement. While media and digital advocacy provide powerful tools, they also present unique challenges for the Subanen. Misrepresentation by external media, cultural commodification, and digital privacy risks are constant concerns. Videos or images of sacred rituals can be taken out of context, exploited for entertainment, or misused commercially, undermining the cultural and spiritual significance of these practices. To mitigate these risks, Subanen communities maintain strict protocols regarding what is documented, shared, or publicized, ensuring that control remains in the hands of the community. On the opportunity side, media engagement enables intergenerational learning, supports education initiatives, and strengthens advocacy for ancestral domain and environmental protection. It allows the Subanen to construct and disseminate their own narratives, challenging colonial-era stereotypes and contemporary marginalization. By strategically employing media, communities can integrate traditional knowledge, cultural pride, and technological skills to influence policy, engage allies, and educate both insiders and outsiders. This balance between caution and innovation reflects a broader pattern in Subanen history: the capacity to adapt to external pressures, harness new tools for survival, and maintain cultural integrity. Through media and digital advocacy, the Subanen ensure that their stories, struggles, and heritage continue to resonate in an increasingly connected and complex world, reinforcing a culture of resilience, knowledge preservation, and empowerment. Reflecting on the long history of the Subanen, one observes a continuous thread of resilience and adaptation that has persisted from the Spanish colonial period to the present. Despite repeated efforts at dispossession, cultural suppression, and political marginalization, the Subanen have maintained an unbroken link to their ancestral lands, rituals, and social structures. Spanish colonization attempted to impose Catholic conversion and centralized governance, often dismissing indigenous customs as backward or pagan. When the Americans arrived, they redefined the Subanen as non-Christian tribes, restricting citizenship, imposing laws like the Public Land Act of 1903, and promoting settler migration into fertile plains. Each phase of colonization presented existential threats to Subanen identity, yet the community employed diverse strategies of resistance, retreating to upland forests, maintaining rituals and secrecy, and using oral epics to preserve collective memory. During the martial law era and post-independence periods, Subanen leaders navigated logging concessions, mining interests, and homestead programs while preserving ancestral knowledge. The adoption of legal frameworks like the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997 represents a culmination of centuries of strategic persistence, turning ancestral wisdom into modern legal recognition. Historical reflection reveals that Subanen resistance is not defined by grandiose battles, but by the quiet, consistent assertion of identity, cultural practices, and stewardship of the land, demonstrating that resilience can take myriad forms beyond conventional warfare. Looking to the future, the Subanen face both challenges and unprecedented opportunities. Environmental degradation, climate change, corporate interests, and urban migration remain pressing concerns, threatening the continuity of cultural practices and ancestral stewardship. Yet, emerging technologies, global networks, and evolving governance structures provide new avenues for empowerment. Digital platforms allow youth to document rituals, map ancestral domains, and advocate for environmental protection, while international recognition of cultural heritage, such as UNESCO's listing of the Buklog, strengthens visibility and credibility. Education programs integrating formal subjects with cultural literacy equip the next generation to navigate complex political, legal, and environmental landscapes. Leadership development, intergenerational mentorship, and participation in national and international indigenous networks ensure that the Subanen can assert agency in shaping their own futures. Furthermore, collaboration with NGOs, government agencies, and academic institutions creates technical and financial capacity for sustainable community development. The fusion of tradition, technology, and activism positions the Subanen to address contemporary challenges while maintaining the integrity of their culture and ancestral relationships. Future prospects, therefore, are intertwined with the principles of continuity, adaptability, and strategic engagement, values that have guided the Subanen through centuries of external pressures. At the heart of the Subanen story is enduring resistance, a resistance that manifests not only in defense of land, but in the perpetuation of culture, ritual, and identity. Resistance is evident in the continued practice of the Buklog, the transmission of oral epics, the mentorship of youth, and the assertion of ancestral domain rights through legal, political, and advocacy channels. It is reflected in environmental stewardship, where sustainable farming, forest conservation, and river management maintain ecological balance in the face of external exploitation and climate change. Resistance is also adaptive. The Subanen integrate modern technologies, digital advocacy, and formal education without abandoning ancestral knowledge or spiritual principles. Each ritual performed, story told, or land claim filed is an act of defiance and affirmation, signaling that culture and identity cannot be fully erased, even under the pressures of globalization or corporate expansion. In this sense, the Subanen embody a form of resistance that is patient, persistent, and multifaceted, encompassing spiritual, cultural, environmental, and political dimensions. As new generations inherit the legacy of the past, they carry forward both the lessons and strategies of their ancestors, ensuring that the Subanen community remains vibrant, adaptive, and sovereign. The narrative of the Subanen, therefore, is not only a history of survival, but also a roadmap for the continuation of cultural integrity, environmental responsibility, and communal resilience in the centuries to come. Their story demonstrates that resistance is not always loud or violent. Sometimes, it is the quiet, deliberate act of living according to one's values, preserving heritage, and asserting identity, a legacy that endures across time. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the incredible history of the Subanen people. Today, we have traced a remarkable story from Spanish and American colonization through post-war marginalization, martial law challenges and modern advocacy, to the present-day struggles and triumphs of cultural preservation, environmental stewardship, and legal recognition. We have seen how the Subanen resisted not through grand battles alone, but through the quiet persistence of their rituals, oral epics, and communal authority, how they adapted without surrendering, and how their culture and identity have endured despite centuries of external pressures. We explored how youth leadership, education, digital advocacy, and international recognition, including the UNESCO inscription of the Buklog ritual, have become instruments of empowerment and cultural continuity. The moral of this story is clear. Resistance comes in many forms, and survival is not merely physical, but cultural, spiritual, and communal. True resilience is demonstrated in the ability to adapt, to preserve knowledge, and to assert identity in the face of forces that seek to erase it. We hope that today's journey has deepened your understanding of the Subanen, inspired you to value untold histories, and reminded you that every community, no matter how marginalized, has a story worth telling. We invite you to continue exploring with us here on History Teller YT. Subscribe, share, and join our growing community as we uncover more hidden histories, celebrate resilience, and honor the voices of those who came before us. Remember, each story is more than a tale of the past. It is a lesson, an inspiration, and a reminder that the spirit of humanity endures through courage, knowledge, and connection. So stay tuned, because on History Teller YT, there are countless histories waiting to be told, and the journey is only beginning.